Hi, we're Fay and Matt Doyle, and we're photographers, filmmakers, and the founders of the multimedia platforms This Expansive Adventure. Our work collaboratively is all about nature. It's all about the great outdoors, and it's all about how connecting to nature can help you become much happier, much more fulfilled, and also how that can make you become much more compassionate to saving it. So we have been doing this for a number of years now collaboratively, and we both started our careers before this in photography and post-production, so we've got a really long-standing experience in working in high-end advertising, etc, etc. And we turned our lens to the landscape about 5 years ago now, when we started getting into hiking and traveling, and since then we have traveled the world in search of beautiful landscapes, incredible places, and a feeling of a sense of joy that for us is very hard to match in any other way. So a lot of our work involves us hiking, going on adventures that are really kind of interesting to us. And one of the things that's really important for us in our work is the idea of working with what's there and photographing, just looking at what's there and really appreciating what's there, and working with the landscape in the way it wants to present itself that day.
Before the pandemic, we used to travel all over the world to make our images. However, that all changed with COVID. And I think with a lot of people, they found, and we did as well, we thought initially that this would put a stop to us creating things, but we've actually taken it as an opportunity to get to know or to reacquaint ourselves with places that we maybe thought were very familiar to us. So we've come back to Snowdonia in North Wales, and this is a place we've been coming to for years, and it is absolutely spectacular, but perhaps in some ways we kind of thought we photographed all there was to photograph here, which, I mean, kind of sounds a bit ridiculous, but I'm sure many people are familiar with that feeling. So what we're trying to do here is to see the landscape in a fresh light, and, you know, we really think that landscape photography is not a static thing. It's something that's constantly changing. The weather is always different, and some scenes you've got to work really quickly to get them because they change so much from moment to moment. So we're here to see what we can spot and to see what we can make of this spectacular place.
We're taking you right now on one of our favourite hikes in the area, where we're going to shoot one of our first panoramas. When thinking about the way we shoot, for us it isn't about presets or relighting things in post-production, but about capturing the emotion of what's there. It's about having a sense of mindfulness and really connecting to the environment that we're in, whatever the weather. When I think about the ways that my emotional connection to a space I've been in affects the final look and feel of our images, it's all about an emotional representation. So capturing how it felt to be there, noticing the different smells and listening to the sounds of what's happening in the feeling of the air.
So, as well as producing regular images here, we're also going to be producing panoramic images. Now, this is where we take a series of frames and we'll use Affinity to automatically stitch them together to create these quite impactful, wide vista images. Now, you can produce panoramas in a wide range of ways. You can just pan the camera handheld. You can shoot them on a tripod, but there's a number of things that you can do to make life an awful lot easier for you. So I'm gonna just go through a few things that we can do that you can do quickly that'll make life a lot easier when you're producing them. So first of all, we're working on a tripod, and it's very important that the tripod is level. So that means that you're going to have a horizon line running through it, and you want it to be as straight as possible. Now, I'm not just talking about getting the camera platform level, I mean getting the tripod legs level. Now, annoyingly on this one, I have to take the head off in order to see the bubble level, but you can see the legs are level. So let's get the head on. Now, got the head on, and the benefit of having the legs level is that when I am panning, this isn't gonna go on the wonk as I pan around. The camera platform is level too. Now, the other thing that you can do is, ordinarily, you might just pop your camera on and pan around. Now, what can happen when you do that is that you can encounter parallax error. Now, parallax error is when you might have encountered this if you've done panoramic work yourself. It's where the stitching software can line up one plane in the image, but maybe something that's a bit further away doesn't line up. And the only way to fix this sometimes is to spend an awful lot of time retouching the file. It can be a real pain. Now, that isn't a fault with the stitching software at all. It's literally just a limit of optics. But fortunately, there is a way around that, and that is to work with the nodal point. So this is, rather than panning around the axis in your camera, you're going to pan around what's called the nodal point, which is usually somewhere in the middle of the lens. It varies a little bit. And you can get specific tripod heads that are designed for nodal point work, and they can be really useful if you're doing architecture or interiors, but they tend to be quite expensive. They're quite bulky and heavy things as well. So if you're budget conscious, if you need to travel and pack light like we do, or if you're just dipping your toes into things, you can get these nodal sliders that just fit into your tripod quick release, and these are relatively inexpensive, and they're a more cost-effective way to achieve the same thing. So I wanted to show you a quick way to determine the nodal point of a certain lens. Now, if you look online, you'll find loads of guides and tutorials about better and more accurate ways to do this. And, you know, by all means, if you've got the time and you want to set things up in a studio and work it out that way, you'll probably get much more accurate results than this. But this is just almost like a quick thing that you can do on location to determine, maybe not the precise nodal point, but something close to it. And even if you don't get it absolutely bang on, if you're panning around something that's close to it, it will minimize any errors. So the amount of retouching that you might have to do to fix parallax error is going to be minimized from this. So it's still a very helpful thing to do. Now, as you can see at the moment, I've got the camera set up on a level tripod and head, and at the moment it's panning, well, as it would do if it was attached normally. Now, what I've done is, I'm looking through my viewfinder, I found two objects that line up. I've got a rock in the foreground, and I've got this rock a little bit further behind it, and you can see at the top that they line up. Now, they're in the center of the frame. If I pan the camera so that they're at the edge, you will see that the rock in the background moves very slightly, ever so slightly, in relation to the one in the front. And that's parallax error, and that's what we're trying to fix. If you just pan as things were at the moment, that's where you get all of these stitching errors when you bring the component images into Affinity. So what we're going to do is we're going to unlock the slider and we're going to move it back. Now at the moment the image is still in, we're moving the camera back, and at the moment the objects, the items that we need to align are still at the edge of the frame, and as we move back you'll see that that error, that little shift, starts to correct itself. And once the two have, once you're back into the two items are aligned as they, or the two objects are aligned as they were at the start, then that is your nodal point, or your approximate nodal point. You can look at the slider, you can make a note of the settings. I've got it at just roughly the 106mm setting by the looks of it, so I'll make a note of that, and that's going to be my nodal point that I can use for a pan. Now it's worth bearing in mind that if you're using a zoom lens like this, your nodal point could be different at every zoom setting, and depending on your lens it might be different based on where you're focused at as well. So you'll need to experiment with the lenses that you've got to find out what works. But in a nutshell, that's it. And it should be that if I make a panorama now, the images should stitch up with no, or hopefully just minimal parallax error. So one of the downsides of producing panoramas is that you're shooting the image in sections, so you've got no way of actually visualizing the final product, as it were, when on the camera back. Now, one of the great things about Affinity Photo is that the iPad version mirrors pretty much feature for feature the desktop versions, and that includes the panorama persona. So when we're on location, either back in the hotel or right up here on a hillside with some sheep, I can get some images open in Affinity and I can stitch a panorama, and I can check right here on location that we've actually got the image that we set out to achieve. So we've been out making panoramic landscape images, and we're now ready to stitch the resulting files together in Affinity Photo, and we're going to be using the panorama persona to do this. So I'm going to start off by opening up some images. I'm going to click on the little plus in the top right hand side of the screen, and I'm going to choose to import from cloud. And you'll see here we've got 4 files that are going to compose our panorama. These are all raw files, Nikon NEF files as it happens, and I'm going to click on the first one to open it up, and it will open in the develop persona in Affinity. Now, you may notice my interface looks a little bit different here. That's because I'm left-handed, and I've enabled the preference for the left-handed interface, and that just flips the menus around so that usually these tools on the right are on the left-hand side and so on, and it just makes it a little bit quicker to work with if you're left-handed. So if you're like me in that sense, by all means go ahead and set that up. Now, as I say, we've got this image open in the develop persona, and we're going to apply a few corrections on it. You can stitch panoramas directly from raw files, but unless you're just checking that everything aligns okay, you're probably going to want to make a few adjustments first. So I don't tend to do very much with raw files. I'm going to add a little bit of clarity, 35% or thereabouts, and I'm going to add a fairly gentle S-curve to it, just something like this. You could use the contrast sliders. I personally prefer using curves. And you can see here, if we hit the split option so we can see before and after, you'll see that the clarity and the curve, it just adds a little bit more of a kick to the file without it looking overly sharpened. And you can see there, it just seems to boost the small details in it, and I quite like how that looks. So to be honest, that's probably all of the adjustments we'll do on this image. So I'm going to just tap to develop, and I'm just going to export this before I stitch it. So I'll go in here, and first of all I'm going to convert the document. It's got the sRGB profile applied, so I'm going to convert that to Adobe 98. And also, to speed things up a little bit, I'm going to work in 8 bits per pixel. By all means, if you want to work in 16 bits, go for it, but I find 8-bit works absolutely fine. It doesn't give me any problems for the kind of work that we do. So I'll tap apply on those. And now I'm going to export this, and I'm going to export it as a TIFF. I'm just checking everything else here looks okay. We'll apply LZW compression. That's lossless, so it'll make the files smaller, but it won't affect the quality of them whatsoever. And I'll tap on OK. And I've got a process TIFF folder all ready to go, so I'll save in there. Now I've got another 3 images that I need to work up like this, so I'm gonna just keep going with these, and we'll speed this section up because you've seen it on one, so you don't need to see it on all of them.
Our work is about trying to convey a sense of the places we visit and the emotions we experience when there. Our work is always about working with what's already in the scene, and we never relight our images or create things that were not present in the original capture.
Okay, so I've applied my settings to all 4 of the raw images that I'm using. So the images should all have a similar amount of clarity and a similar curve applied. It doesn't matter if it's not exactly the same, because Affinity will balance the exposure, the general brightness and contrast of the images when it's blending the panorama, but it's always good to get things in the same general ballpark. So if you've perhaps shot your panorama with, I don't know, maybe auto white balance and things change between them, it's a good idea to try and level that out a little bit at this stage. Now, I'm going to click the plus again, and I'm going to go into produce a new panorama. I'll click on the little cloud icon underneath the panel on the left, and I am going to go and select my processed TIFFs. So I can select all 4 of them, and done. Let's try that again. I can select all 4 of them and open. Here they are, and then I'll click to stitch. And this can take a little while whilst Affinity, the panorama persona, is thinking about it. And here we go. It's got the panorama made up. I'll click OK. And this next stage can sometimes take a little while, bearing in mind it's dealing with an awful lot of data. So here we go. We have the stitched panorama. Now, it's a good idea at this point to zoom in and have a look at some of your joins on it. If I select the brush tool here, I can click on the image and we'll see this grey overlay, and this will show me, I can zoom in here, and this will show me the areas where the image joins up. And I can go back to the hand tool and have a look. And we can see here that there is a tiny little bit of, I don't know what you might call it, a little smudge where the join is. So I'm going to work with the brush tool, quite small. I can click and drag to the left to make it a bit smaller. And I'm just going to brush through. And I'll need to render the panorama again. This can be a little bit of a lengthy process, but it's worth doing because it'll save you some work later on. And this should hopefully correct any little errors that we find in the panorama.
We sped this section up as it's quite a time-consuming part of the process. If you've worked out the nodal point for your lens, you should have minimal work to do here. If not, you might find that there are some stitching errors you can't fix at this stage. You'll need to make a mental note of these and fix them later. You might need to prepare yourself for a lot of retouching work. Working out a lens's nodal point might seem tedious, but it can save you a lot of time at this stage.
So once we're happy with the panorama, and I'm kind of happy that everything's looking okay at this point, I'll just tap apply. And the panorama will now open up in Affinity Photo's Photo Panorama, and from here we can start working on it. So first things first, you'll notice that we've got a few little bits on the edge where the image doesn't go right up to the edge of the image. Now, you might want to crop these out, or you might want to look at cloning or compositing in something to fill them up. I find that when you've just got little bits like this, a really great way to deal with them is to use the Liquify persona just to stretch the image out in these areas. It doesn't really do anything that I think is too distracting, and I think it's a good way to just fill the frame with your image. Now, first of all, to make things a little bit easier, I'm going to add in a new fill layer. And I'll just set the color to something really vivid, like this, bright magenta. And I'm going to click and drag that underneath the panorama. So this straight away, we can see more easily the bits where we need to liquefy the image to move it out. Next, I'm going to duplicate my panorama layer. Now, the reason for this is I've just always think it's great to have an original untouched copy of the image in your file just to reference back to. So you can see if anything that you're doing like liquefying, you can quickly compare by switching the layer on and off to see if you've gone too far. So I've duplicated the layer and I'm going to work on the duplicate. So I'm going to enter the Liquify persona. I'm going to turn the hardness of the brush right down, and I'm going to give myself a really nice big brush. Bigger the better with this. It's going to be a big brush but small moves. So I'll just click and drag out. Okay, so I've committed the Liquify, and I can just toggle that on and off, and I can see here that it's not doing anything too crazy to the image, but still it fills out those little gaps. So I'm happy with that. Now, ordinarily at this point I'd move straight on to a color treatment or a color grade for this image, but one thing about this particular panorama is that I noticed there was a fair bit of dust on the camera sensor, and I want to do something about that. You can see it here in the clouds, and also you can see it here in the lake in the center. And unfortunately I'd noticed the dust, but I was on location and there was nothing we could really do to clean the sensor there and then. So sadly, I realized I'd have to spot this out. So I'm going to get working on that. Now, it can be a little bit difficult to see the dust in the clouds sometimes. So what I'm going to do to help myself here is I'm going to pop in a curves adjustment. and I'm literally going to just darken down the highlights. Now this is what I would call a visualization layer, and it is literally just there to help me spot the dust. So it just makes things a little bit easier to see once I've got that on. Now, I'm going to duplicate my my pixel layer again, and I'm gonna zoom in and start doing some spotting work. My preferred tool for this is actually the patch tool, and it works really nicely. You can just draw a circle around the bit you want to remove and just get rid of it like that. So let's get spotting.
Of course, you should try and clean your sensor regularly, but dust like this is sometimes unavoidable and is just the reality of digital photography. We try to avoid cleaning the sensor on location unless absolutely necessary. You can sometimes make the situation far worse if you attempt to clean on location.
Okay, so there we go. The dust spotting is done, and of course, if we spot some more later on, we can always go back and get rid of it there and then. So I'm going to get rid of my visualization curve. Next up, it's good for us to start working on the color treatment or the grade on this image. Now, most of the adjustments that we work with are quite straightforward. We don't use a lot of different types of filters, but it's more to do with the way that we use them. So the key adjustment that we use in our work is curves. And I'm a really big fan of curves. It gives you a fantastic amount of control. If you're happier using perhaps levels or whatever, then by all means do that. But I just think for me over the years, I've kind of found that curves just gives you the best kind of fine level of control in your color grading. So we're going to start off just by introducing a gentle S-curve. So we're going to pull down the shadows, lift the mids a little, and lift the highlights. Maybe we can rein back the shadows a touch. And we're just going to adjust a little bit from here. So the idea is constantly switching on and off to see what we're doing. It's basically to look at what it's bringing to the image. And already I really like what this is doing to the foreground. We're losing a little bit of detail in the clouds, but I'm not overly worried about that. Next, we're going to add another curves layer. That can go in underneath. And I'm going to use the gradient tool here because I just want this curve to affect the right hand side of the image. Now if I look at the left hand side here, I can see that there's some really nice contrast, but the right hand side just seems a touch flatter by comparison. So I'm going to pick a linear gradient, and I'm going to drag right to left. I'll select the grey point, or the end point, and I'm going to move it up to black. So that we can see here from the layer's mask, the layer will affect the right hand side of the image and gradually fall off as we move to the left. So let's look at this curves adjustment now. And we can see if I do something extreme, we can see that it's impacting the right hand side more. So I'm just going to give that a slight lift, just so that both sides of the image are in the same world. There we go. And generally, we prefer to put our overall adjustments on top with more localized adjustments underneath. The reason for that being is that if you'll see at the top of the image, we've kind of blown out a lot of the detail in the sky, which we will be restoring later on, by the way. But if we're going to put something in to darken the sky, it's better to do that underneath the adjustment layer that lightens it. Now, one thing that I, and in fact Fay as well, have a big problem with is the colour green. Now, that's quite funny, actually, if you think about it, as we're landscape photographers, so you think that would be a real issue. But the problem we have is not so much with the colour green, but more with the way that digital cameras render it. And when I look at this, I see a green that looks, well, for me, frankly, a little bit like toxic waste. So what we want to do is we want to make it look a little bit more natural, something that's a little more in line with what we've seen with our eyes. So basically what I'm going to do is I've added in a selective color adjustment that can go on top of the curves. And we've actually found that even though it's green we don't like, it's actually yellow that you want to be adjusting. So I'm going to pop the range to yellow. I'm going to reduce the cyan. We'll start off about -40. We can always fine tune this, of course. And just add in a touch of magenta as well. Perhaps +15. So I can switch that on and off. And we can see that it just shifts the green a little bit more. It's still green, but it's a little bit more red. It's holding a little bit more red in there. And for me, that's a nice effect. Perhaps it's gone a little bit too far. So I'm going to go into the layer options, and I'm just going to pull back the all over opacity of that adjustment. Let's bring it down to, say, 65%. And this is something I quite regularly do. If I make an adjustment that I generally like it, but think it's maybe gone a bit too far, I'll just pull back a little bit on the opacity. So there we go. Now straight away I think that's much better already. It's quite a subtle difference, but for me that feels a lot more natural, and more critically, it's closer to how I remember the scene looking. And this is I think the key thing in our color grading. We're not trying to create something that wasn't there. We're not trying to relight the images, but we are trying to communicate our experience of the place, what we thought, what we felt whilst we were there. And for me, that's not just about the light, about the contrast, it's also about the color. And for me, this original green, it looks too artificial, it looks too chemical, for want of a better way of describing it, whereas that feels a lot more natural to me. Now, whilst we're making these adjustments, I can look at the mountains on the right hand side and I can see that the shadow areas are holding quite a lot of blue. Again, this is very natural. If you've shot a lot of landscapes, you've no doubt seen that before. So I'm going to go in and I'm going to add in a HSL layer, hue, saturation, luminosity. And this is, again, the blue in the shadows. It's a natural thing in photography, but your eyes correct for it. So for me, that seems a little bit artificial. So I'm going to work on the blues. And basically what I like to do here is to just shift the hue a little bit. So I shift it a little bit towards the right, which makes it less blue and a little bit more cyan. And then I pull down the saturation. Now, this does two things. First of all, it's going to neutralize out that blue in the shadows a little bit, but also shifting it towards cyan is very useful, because cyan is, of course, the complementary color to red. We've shifted the grass to red, and we're going to now shift the blues slightly more cyan. So you've got a complementary color pair there, and that, in principle, should be more pleasing to viewers' eyes. So let's have a look at how that's going. So I do like that. I think the effect is a little bit strong. So again, let's just pull the opacity a touch. Not much. Maybe down to about 75% or thereabouts. And then let's see how it is. That's working well for me, I think. Okay. Now, I still see a little bit too much color in here. I'd like this rock to be a little bit more neutral. One of the features I really love in Affinity Photo is that it has a quick mask mode. Now, this is easy to get into in the desktop version, but it's kind of hidden away a little bit on the iPad version. I think this is a really powerful feature, so let's have a look at how it works. At the moment we're in the photo persona, I'm gonna switch over into the selection persona. And it's right down here, we've got selection as layer, and then I can toggle edit selection as layer. This makes the image red. Now, I'm going to go back into the photo persona, I'm going to switch to my brush tool, and I'm going to make sure I'm brushing in white. I'll adjust my brush size a little bit. That's good, and I'm just going to pull the opacity a little bit. By the way, I tend to use the accumulation and flow linked to the pressure of my Apple Pencil. And that means that I can basically build up, I can control the opacity of the effect based on how hard I'm leaning. So I'm going to brush over like this, and we see that this red area is vanishing. And this might seem a little bit strange, but we're going to go back into the selection persona. We'll go back down and we're going to toggle edit selection as layer. And we've just created a selection for our rocks on the right. Now, this means I can go in and I can add another HSL layer. I'm also going to deselect. And you'll see that because I've added the layer whilst the selection was active, Affinity Photo has automatically added a layer mask for me. Now I can just go into my ranges. I'll start off with cyan, and I'm going to desaturate that, maybe take a little bit out of the blue as well. So we see right there that what we're doing is we're neutralizing the top of that mountain, and I quite like that. If we feel we've missed a little bit, I can go back into my photo persona and use the brush tool, and I can work in black and white, just brushing on that layer mask just to either increase or decrease the size of the effect. So there we go. Now, so far, so good. Everything's coming together quite nicely. The main issue I have is that we've lost a bit of detail in the sky. I also feel the image is still a little bit cool. So let's have a look at our main curve here. And we can see here there's some nice detail in the sky that seems to have gone. So again, I'm going to go back to my brush tool. I'm going to get myself working in black. And I'm going to work straight on the layers mask. Large brush. I'll turn the opacity down to about, say, 30%. And I'm basically just going to brush away, and this should start, and this will start to bring back the detail in the clouds. I've set the opacity low, so it's a gradual process. Now you could go and you could mask the sky out, draw a path around it, use a variety of selection tools, but you know, I started off my career in photographic post-production working in a darkroom, and most of the time we did dodging and burning, just very softly waving our hands over the images, and it worked very well there. So I see no reason why we can't extend that technique to our digital workflow. So there we go. So I can now flip that on and off, and we can see that we've restored some detail in the sky. Now, so far everything is coming together quite nicely. I do still feel the image is a little bit cool though, so I'll add in another curve for now. They're up. And I am going to just go into the magenta curves, and I am going to, so your colors work in pairs. The complementary of magenta is green, so I can drag up to add green and drag down to add magenta. I'm just going to add a smidge of magenta into this. I'll go to blue, well, yellow in this case. And I can drag up to add blue, which is the complementary of yellow, or I can pull down to add yellow, which is what I want here. So I'm adding a touch of yellow and a touch of magenta, which will just warm up the image a fraction. There we go. So let's have a look at that. On and off. Now it's quite a subtle effect, but for me it's just warming the image up quite nicely. Now, the next thing we want to do is we need to start bringing the viewer's attention into the image. I think the lake is really the center of attention here. So this is a perfect opportunity to add a vignette in to help us bring our attention into the center of the frame. So basically we want our viewers looking at the lake in the middle rather than having their attention drifting off to something towards the edge of the image. So this is a perfect opportunity to set up a vignette. So a vignette is basically where we're going to be darkening the corners of the images, but we're also going to do a reverse vignette as well, where we lighten the center as well. And those two things combined will help bring our viewer's gaze straight into the middle of the image. So I'm going to start off by adding a curves adjustment. Just make sure that you're working on the master. It's still set to here. It was still set to blue from the last time. I'm going to start off by applying this as an all over. So we'll darken the image down. And I like to, rather than just darkening, I like to add a little bit of contrast as well. So we'll lift the highlights, keep them where they are, but we're just going to drop the shadows and the midtones a bit. Another thing here is that when you apply a curve and it darkens the image, you'll also see it seems to boost the saturation. So you see here the greens and the reds have gone quite vivid. That can be a useful effect, but it's not quite what I want here. And also the vivid colours will tend to draw the viewer's eyes out towards the edge of the frame. We don't want that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into my layer styles and I'm going to flip the blending mode to luminosity. Which is here. Now what luminosity does is it gives us, it basically will mean that the curve adjusts the contrast, but it doesn't boost the saturation. Now sometimes, like here, that effect can be quite subtle and it might still seem like it's boosting the saturation, but believe me, it is doing something. So we're going to go back into our curves and I'm going to create the vignette. So I'm going to go back and select my gradient tool. I'm going to set the type to elliptical and I'm just going to drag out from the center. Now at the moment we've got the effect going from the middle out. We want it going from the outside in. So I'm going to click on these little circles on the edge and I can change the colors. We want to change the outer point to white, pure white, which is where the effect hit, which means that the adjustment layer is affecting that part of the image the most. And in the center, I'm going to change that to black. And that means that the adjustment layer is not affecting that part of the image at all. We can see the top of the mountains is going quite dark, so this is a good opportunity to move things around, or to move that to move the gradient around a little bit. I can drag it out a touch more, and we can also just flip that layer on and off to see what's going on. So that's nice. I think it's a little bit much, so let's go in and pull the opacity back a touch. Again, maybe 60, so let's say 55% for starters. About there. 54 in fact. So that's adding something. In fact, having looked at that, I would say that could go a little bit heavier. So let's bring that up to say 65. There we go. On and off. So we can see there it's really bringing our eye into the center of the frame. Next, we're going to add the complementary part to the vignette. So the second curve that will brighten the center of the image. So that and the darkening of the edges, they'll work in harmony to really bring your eye into the middle of the frame. So I'm going to add another curve. And I'm just going to lift from the midpoint and the highlights. But again, it's all about contrast. It's not just about lifting, it's about lifting with contrast. So I'm just going to make sure that the shadows are brought back towards where they were. So they're kind of anchored, but we're lifting with the midtones and the highlights. So we can start off with something like that. We can have a quick look at that on and off. Next, I'll go back to my vignettes. My gradients, I should say. I'll change the type to elliptical, and I am going to drag from the center out. Something like that for starters. And once again, I'll adjust the color at this point. So it's going white to white to black. So that means basically the image is going to be lighter in the middle and the effect will trail off towards the edge. So we can switch that on and off to see what we're getting there. Now that seems to be working quite well for me. I do kind of feel like the center of the frame is a touch cool. So I'm going to go back into that curve. I'm going to go onto the red channel and I'm just going to introduce a touch of red, just a tiny bit. So let's see what we've got there. There to there. So it's brightening the image and also adding in a touch of warmth into the middle as well. And I think that's looking really nice. Now, at this point, I'm quite happy with the image, but there's just one more step I want to do here. So this is a bit of a weird adjustment. It's not one of the normal ones, but it's something that I really like and I work into an awful lot of our images. So rather than just adding in a normal adjustment, I'm going to hit the plus and I'm going to put in a fill layer. And I want this to be orange, basically. Something like that'll do. Maybe a touch more golden. There, something like that. So we've got this orange layer. I'm now going to go into layer options and I'm going to set the blending mode to multiply. Here we go. Now, so far you might be wondering what I'm doing here, but I'm then going to pull the opacity right down. Let's say down to about 3 to 4%. This is going to be quite a subtle effect. Let's start off with say 3. I always think less is more with this. That's a 2 actually. Bring it up to, there we go, 3%. And let's have a look at how that is. It's quite subtle. It could maybe have a touch more. I'm going to bring that up to say 5%. There we go. Now, a lot of you are probably saying, well, couldn't you just do that using the photo filter adjustment? And yes, you could get something quite close with it. But what I like about using a solid color on multiply is that it gives you a tiny little kick of contrast, especially it just seems to enhance the shadows and midtones a little bit. And for me, I just think it gives you a little something else. So it's a trick I've been using for a long time and something that I quite like. I'm actually, whilst I'm at it, I'm going to bring that up a little bit more, maybe to 7%. I always like to start off this effect low and then gradually dial it up. One thing that's quite nice about this is that it puts sort of a uniform color over the entire image as well. And to my eye, it just seems to tie everything together. So you can start to see that without it, to my eye, the sky suddenly looks very cold, whereas with it, it just seems to make the image seem a lot more homogeneous, I suppose. It's an effect that's similar to if you remember using filters on your film photography. It's a little bit like using, say, an 81C filter over the lens. That was a really nice warming filter that a lot of landscape photographers used to use, and it's an effect that I quite like. So yeah, so I think for now we've probably worked up this image to a level that I'm quite happy with on the iPad. At this stage, I think it's looking pretty good, and I'm ready. I'll save up now and I'll be ready to reopen this image shortly on the desktop version of Affinity Photo, and that's where we can get into doing final refining and just checking how it all looks on a calibrated screen. So I'm back in the studio and I have our image open in the desktop version of Affinity Photo. Now, the iPad edition of the software is really powerful and it has pretty much all of the features that you'll find in the full desktop version. However, one of the things I find, and this isn't a criticism of the iPad software itself so much as maybe a comment on the dynamics of the touch interface, but I find that sometimes a lot of the features are kind of hidden away on the iPad version. Now, what I find is that that means I can work a lot more fluidly on the desktop version. So if I want to maybe work quickly, do quite a few changes, I'll often find myself still gravitating towards the desktop version when I can. So I've got our image open and I'm going to make a couple more adjustments to it before it's completely finished. First of all, I'm going to tidy the file up. So I'm going to get rid of this magenta fill that we used earlier, and I'm going to use Control, Shift and E on this Windows PC to merge my two retouching layers. That was the one I liquefied and also the one that I did the dust spotting on. So you can see we can just turn that on and off. I still have the original layer in the file. Now, next I'm going to start enhancing some details, and the first thing I want to do is I want to enhance this grey rock on the mountain, make it pop out a little more. So I've got the brush tool active here, and I'm going to click on this item at the top, which brings me into quick mask mode. This was the feature I mentioned earlier. You've got to dig for it a little bit on the iPad version, but it's very easily accessible on the desktop. You can also use the Q key to toggle it, which I'll be using from now on. So I'm just painting roughly over the rock. I'll hit Q again to leave that, and then I can just put a curves adjustment in, Control key and D to deselect, and then I can start adjusting. So I'm going to lift the rock. It makes it go perhaps a little bit fuzzy. So I'm going to bring the shadows back down a little bit, lift the mids a touch more, and I'm also going to split to the red channel and maybe just put in 1 or 2 clicks of cyan just to take a little bit of that warmth out of it. So let's see how that's looking. That's pretty good. Next, I'm going to have a look at this top right hand corner, and I can see that there isn't any real shadow here, and we can also see there isn't very much detail in the clouds behind. That's because, as I remember, the sun was behind here and we've got a bit of flare on the go, so I'd like to make a bit more of a feature out of this. So I'm going to pop another curve in. As you can probably tell, I like working in curves, and I'm going to lift the shadows. Now normally I don't like losing that maximum black in images, but in this case, if I want to emphasize a flare, I think it's okay. So again, I'm possibly going to go a little bit too far with this, but we can always pull the effect back afterwards. So I've added that in. I'm going to have a look at the blue channel, and I'm just going to nudge it down at the top of the white point just to put a little bit of yellow into the highlights. And I'll do the same with the green channel just to pop in a bit of magenta, and this is just going to very slightly warm up that highlight a little bit. Very subtle, but it is there. Next, I'm going to select the gradient tool because we don't want to apply this to the whole image. I'll select radial gradient, and I'm just going to pull out from that top corner. Now again, this is going from white to mid-grey, so we can see that this is still affecting the entire image. We just want it to affect the top corner. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click to get this grey point selected, and I'm just going to go up to my picker here and I'm going to turn that to black. So we're just limiting our effect to the top right corner of the image. There we go. Now I'm going to work on and maybe do a few more changes to this image.
We often meet other photographers on location who are disappointed by the scene in front of them because it doesn't look like other images of the place that they've seen online. And we think it's really important to unshackle yourself from this idea in landscape photography. Different light, different times of year and day all completely change the places we visit. Just because you've seen a beautiful image of a place made in a certain way, it doesn't mean that that's the only way to photograph it well. We make absolutely no apologies for the fact that our work is post-produced, and sometimes very obviously so. We've met many people who claim you shouldn't edit your images at all because that's somehow more authentic or truer to reality, but we completely disagree. Photography and seeing are just completely different things. Your eyes and your brain work together to constantly compensate and correct things in a scene in a way that raw photography simply cannot. The way we see reality is post-processed by our perception. Our aim is to try and make our photographs look more like the scene we experienced. In many ways, we think this is much more authentic than an unedited image.
So we can see here I've made a few more adjustments. I've brought in a little bit more detail at the top in the clouds. I've desaturated these rocks here, and I've also doubled up on the vignette just to make the image a little bit more dramatic. Now at this point I think I'm generally very happy with the image, but one last thing I want to do is to add a little bit of grain to it. Now the reason for this is that I think that digital images can look and feel a bit clinical, almost waxy when you zoom in. So I think it's good to have a little bit of grain in the images. It can make them feel just a bit more organic. Now, I know people who have actually scanned film grain that they use, which is fantastic. But and there's a number of plugins that you can purchase that can build grains for you. But you can actually build quite a nice grain, I think, from within Affinity Photo itself. So I'm going to show you how I do that. So first of all, I'm going to add a pixel layer. I'm going to fill it, and I'm going to fill it with 50% grey. So there we go. Now, it's actually 51% grey, but I think for our purposes that won't make a huge difference. I'm now going to go Filter, Noise, and Add Noise. I'm going to set the intensity to 30%. I'm going to make sure the distribution is left at Gaussian, and I'm going to set it to monochromatic. That's important, and we'll apply that. Next, I'm going to zoom in so I can see things a bit more clearly. I'm going to use Control and plus just to zoom in a little bit closer. So here I am at 100%. Now I'm going to go into Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur, and I'm just going to set that to 0.1 pixels. And you see that gives quite a nice soft grain, which I think feels quite organic. So I've applied that. Now the problem is you can't see your image underneath. So I'm going to go down to my blending modes, and I'm going to set that to soft light. And soft light's really nice. It makes anything that's grey go invisible, and then basically anything that's darker than that mid-grey darkens the image, and anything that's white lightens the image. So, or anything that's lighter lightens the image. So it gives you quite a nice effect. So let's pan around. We've got our grain there, and it is quite subtle. So actually what I'm going to do is I'm going to double it up. So I'm going to copy and paste that layer, and I'm going to pop them both into a group. So I've got them both selected, I've shift clicked and then Control and G to pop them into a group together. So I've just doubled it up, and we can see there, if we flick that on and off, it gives you this fairly subtle grain effect. And for me, I think this is good. It makes the image feel a bit more organic, a little bit more natural. Now, and you can see it specifically in the sky as well. There, it's particularly noticeable, and I think that really helps the image. So let's zoom out and see what we've got. So at this point I'm going to say I'm happy with this image, and at this stage we can flatten the file up and export it as we need it to. One last thing I am going to say though is that scenes as we've got the scenes as we're on the desktop version, it's also fairly easy for us to open other images from the set. And this is handy if I want to just make sure that everything is matching. You know, maybe I need to give a couple of nudges of contrast or color each way to make sure everything's matching up, and that's pretty easy to do on the desktop version, not so easy to do on the iPad version. And of course the other benefit of working on the desktop version is that I've got a hardware calibrated screen here, so I'm pretty confident that what I'm seeing here are colors that are going to be completely accurate, basically. So, yep, I want to thank you for watching in on this, and I hope you found this tutorial useful. Thank you very much.